Good afternoon to all of you here in the room and online. Let me add some thanks to this long list of thanks. I thank first Matthias, Albert, and the whole team here in Krems, Jean-Michel, Daniel, and the team in Liège who make it possible. And, well, thank you for being here. I'm really happy and honored, and I feel the great responsibility of introducing this conference on a topic which is central in many respects. It is central in the political debate on this side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the Atlantic, and more broadly, globally, I would say. It is central in our field of study, and this conference is a testimony of this. But above all, it is central in the lives of millions of migrants and their families, which are daily shaped by the dichotomy, the pitiless sometimes dichotomy between regular and irregular. So this is the topic of today. The title I gave is what you read here: the hollowing of a regular-irregular binary and the post-liberal shift in migration politics. It may sound a bit cryptic, perhaps obscure, I hope also intriguing, and I hope that at the end of this half an hour it will appear a little bit less cryptic and still intriguing, hopefully. So I will proceed as follows. I will first take a deliberately reflexive stance on the topic and focus on the dualism between the normative and the analytical dimension of the regular-irregular binary, and on the problems that this dualism generates. In the second part, I will focus specifically on the regulatory uses of this binary, of this dichotomy, how these uses are evolving. I will describe such evolution as a gradual hollowing, and I will argue that such hollowing is closely associated with what I will call a post-liberal shift in migration policies and politics nowadays. So, reflexive. We work in migration studies often with inappropriate tools, with tools that were not designed to do what we do with them. What do I mean by this? I mean that we often use spurious concepts, concepts that were designed to make things, policies, measures, to pursue practical goals in the political sphere, and that we are using for analytical purposes. And the regular-irregular dichotomy is a perfect and particularly central and relevant example of this spuriousness of our concepts. Using this sort of tools is undeniably problematic, as the picture I showed before suggests. But I also argue that there are often little alternatives, as in the case of this dichotomy. And to explain this better, I would like to cite wise words from Rogers Brubaker, who in an article of some years ago, talking about the category Muslim and its uses, said the use of a term as a category of practice does not disqualify it as a category of analysis. If it did, our analytic vocabulary would be far poorer. The problem, he continues, is not about which categories we should use, but how we use them. And to conclude, he says, we may have no good alternatives to using analytical categories that are heavily loaded, deeply contested. The problem is how we use them, and he ends by saying we can and should adopt a critical and reflexive, self-reflexive stance towards our categories. I find this perfectly wise and agreeable, but not simple. More easily said than done. How to adopt this famous, self-reflexive stance towards our own categories, and in particular towards the category of regularity and irregularity. How to do it? Well, we can build on a long history now of scholarly attempts to put this into practice. The literature has gone a long way in showing possible directions in how to make use of irregular concepts without falling into the traps of being instrumentalized or following, political programs, consciously or more or less unconsciously. The main trends in the literature, I think, can be summarized by reconducting them to three fundamental intellectual moves. The first, most basic move is, at a primary level, terminological, but intrinsically very political, of course, and it consists in the generalized trend towards rejecting the category illegal as applied to persons, but also to behaviors, demographic behaviors like migration. The category is still prevalent. If you browse legal migrant or regular migrant in whatever browser, you will see that there is still a vast prevalence of illegal language out there. But in the academia and in the world of research more generally, the replacement with illegal language with irregular language has been almost total, I would say. Or more recently, irregularized, to stress even more the constructed nature of a category. It's interesting to notice that in this case too, the change didn't originate or didn't only start in the scholarly field. It started in the world of activism. It started in the world of grassroots politics. These are just a few examples of writings on European walls where this refusal of legal-illegal polarity, legal-illegal language is enacted, is performed. Here too we witness, interestingly, a very deep porosity between political language and scholarly language, even though in this case it is grassroots political language. Which doesn't mean that the shift to the irregular language is disqualified. It's just taking place and happening in different forms in different spheres. The next two intellectual moves, which I think summarize what has been happening in literature over the binary in these last 20, 25 years, are more conceptual and more sophisticated, probably more important. The first I would call de-essentialization or denaturalization. Let me use these two terms as equivalents, even though we may discuss if they are. But for this purpose, I think that it can be considered as equivalent. One of the fundamental purposes of social science is showing that things that we take for granted shouldn't be taken for granted. The distinction between legal and illegal behavior, legal and illegal migrants, has long been taken and is still taken as natural in many circles. One of the first to try and to give centrality to the constructed nature of the dichotomy has been Nicholas de Genova, but this is just to mention one of several, innumerable actually, since then, pieces of scientific research who stressed this dimension. Another complementary intellectual move is what I would call debinarization. So showing, as many of us have tried to do, that actually the binary is not a binary. The binary is possibly a spectrum or a plurality of overlapping spectra. And And so constraining it in binary terms, it's itself a political decision, as the opposite is a political choice, ultimately. There are many ways to debinarize, depending on what you look at as a marker of what makes or unmakes the binary. So scholars have been looking, for instance, primarily at different dimensions of irregularity, typically irregularity of migration status, as opposed to regularity or irregularity of employment status. But there are several other dimensions that have been considered. Other authors have been focusing on pathways, as Wikström put it, into irregularity or out of irregularity through legalization processes, amnesties, for instance, different types of amnesties, or end of temporary permit, overstaying as the opposite pathway. Still another way of debinarize the dichotomy and deconstruct the dichotomy in this sense have been focusing on the social value, the social significance given to the binary. My colleague Maurizio Ambrosini, for instance, studied a lot the care sector in Italy, showing how care workers, even though from a migration status point of view, may be exactly in the same situation of irregular construction workers, are seen, perceived, and often treated in the social and legal sphere very differently. Still other ways to debinarize may insist on variations over time of status or variations across space. The European space is still very fragmented. You can be, of course, as we all know, legal one day and illegal the next, depending on frequent policy changes, often unreadable by the targets of these policy changes or difficult to read. But you can also change from regular, irregular by crossing a border, even though this border is not systematically controlled and policed, as with some of the Schengen borders at least. Still another way to complexify the binary is through anemic perspective based on ethnographic approaches. For instance, some colleagues now working in the Gambia and other West African countries tell us about the distinction migrants make between migrants and the milieu they're coming from, between la voie haute à l'immigration, the highway to migration, and la voie basse à l'immigration, where the voie haute is the legal one in all its segments, whereas the voie basse is the irregular and illegal one. Now, this is what I wanted to say about the reflexive part. Now I'm looking more from outside perspective to the political uses, to the normative and regulatory uses that are done of a binary as a category of practice. This is, I think, at least equally important as a research perspective. And I would say it's growing in its importance every day with what we are living through in these last months and weeks in particular. I will try, in the short time I have, to attempt a broad reconstruction of the history of the uses of a binary in the last few decades by schematizing it as articulated into two main phases, two macro phases. One that I would call the golden age of the binary, from sometime in the 70s till the 90s, or late 90s. This is, of course, a very rough periodization, but allow me to do it for the purposes of triggering also a discussion here. And then a second macro phase that what I call the hollowing of a binary, started sometime in the 2000s, but accelerating in the last few years. The golden age of the binary, the dichotomy didn't flourish in isolation, didn't operate in isolation. It was closely, intimately, I would say, connected with a broader ideological and political framework, which is what some, like Adrian Favell, call the integrationist paradigm, integration philosophies, whereby liberal democracies fought and in part still think of themselves and represent themselves as selectively and gradually inclusive. And the normative core of this ideology, of this paradigm, can be summarized, I think, in this kind of implicit motto, either in or out. In with expanding rights, because this is the formal discourse of integration. If you are, if there is no room for you in this, progressive integration path, then you're deemed and doomed to leave somehow through spontaneous means or removal, forcibly removal. And regularization was the, of course, other option in many forms. This operated internally. As a side remark, I think it's important to consider that this kind of paradigm operated also externally, internationally. The success of this regulatory paradigm shows also in international negotiations, and in particular in the globalization of a regular, irregular binary through a number of normative tools, one of which, probably the most important, even though often very neglected, is the Palermo Convention on smuggling and trafficking, the protocols to the conventions that were, it's 2000, it's not 1990, sorry, I had the date wrong, where the dichotomy was kind of exported and globalized. It's important to stress that even in the golden age, what I call the golden age, the binary has never been an accurate sociological description. Pockets of structural, persistent, permanent marginality have always existed. Limbo situations have always existed. Adhocracy in managing situations of forced migration, which in principle should lead to incorporation and regularizations, have often led to refusal of this acknowledgement as regular forced migrants. But in spite of this, the binary was flourishing in ideological terms, was ideologically powerful and successful in producing legitimizing effects. What changes since the late 90s, 2000s? Of course, this is an overall simplification to the extent that I try to portray in a unified way different situations that in different regions and nations and national containers are evolving differently. But I think that all in all, we can witness a trend which challenges increasingly and more radically the binary in both political and political discourses and policy practices, and make the binary decreasingly effective in shaping social realities. Even though, as I said, it was never all powerful in that, but decreasingly so. this is importantly not just the effect of political decisions, of a shift, a growth in anti-migrant populism, but it is also an effect of broader structural trends at socio-economic level. In particular, a growth in socio-economic inequalities in all European, but not only European states, a flexibilization of labor market, a precarization of labor conditions, and a structural housing crisis. All these trends tend to erode the socio-economic basis of integration, and therefore to make the operationalization of a binary less and less viable, more and more problematic. From a policy point of view, the following manifests itself in several policy trends. One is the virtual demise of mass regularizations. We still had some well, the last ones in the States were 40 years ago now, but in Italy, in Europe, we had some a few years ago with pandemic and with alarm for the lack of essential workers, which led some states, Italy, Portugal, to launch the last regularization so far, but also discrete, case-by-case regularizations, which are everyday practice in many European countries, are now challenged and decreasingly practiced, as the French case is showing in these last few months, with some exceptions. We were discussing yesterday with some Spanish colleague of interesting reforms of the Spanish arraigo that seem to go counter this trend. Another long-term trend in policy is the proliferation and growing prevalence of temporary statuses. 20 years ago, Stephen Castles started detecting this trend when he spoke of a resurrection of a guest worker model in Europe, but this has continued and expanded. The diffusion of protracted displacement, a category that had been created to describe forced migration realities in non-European contexts, in African countries, for instance, with encampment of refugees. But this reality of protracted displacement, long time with no durable solution in sight, is something that has been spreading to some European countries as well. And more recently, and more importantly, I would say, the mainstreaming of some distinctive features of radical nativist discourse is the latest and probably the harshest and most worrying symptom of this long-term trend towards the hollowing of a binary. So repeal of citizenship for double citizen, but not only, mass forced removal, mass deportation, or remigration, as in the German political discourse. This is, of course, turning into these horrid icons that are now, colonizing the media sphere worldwide. It's a hyper-politicized and heavily spectacularized shift, but this is far from being limited to the US. The overall impression is that the binary seems to be losing its emancipatory power, which was part of this way to function worldwide, and retaining only its exclusive power. And in this sense, I think we can speak of a hollowing. So to conclude, is all this a symptom of what we could call a post-liberal shift in migration policies, in migration politics? And if so, in which sense? I think so, and I try to argue why, allow me in a bit schematic and axiomatic terms to conclude, a starting assumption, an axiom, if you want, can be that a concretely achievable, a stable, and ultimately non-reversible condition of regularity in a given polity is a precondition for the full recognition of a non-citizen, especially of a non-citizen, but of whatever person, as a fellow human. Someone whose presence here is not tolerated, is legitimate, non-reversible, and non-disposable. So if this is the axiom, regularity is and needs to be viewed as a fundamental value, not just as a technical variable, but as a fundamental value, and is closely associated with the concept of human dignity, which is a concept which is at the core of most of our constitutional traditions, by the way. If so, the hollowing of a binary is not a technical issue, is a major, cultural transition, and it is an intrinsically illiberal trend that is also potentially conducive to further steps in dehumanization. Therefore, and that is my conclusion, defending and expanding regularity is, for many groups, movements, persons, is a fundamental political mission, a fundamental dimension of political activism, grassroots activism, I would say, in particular. And analyzing this hollowing is and should probably remain a crucial scholarly task. And I thank you for your attention.